What I am about to share with you has remained locked in the most sacred vault of my heart for 19 years. A secret so profound and so terrifying in its implications that I have wrestled daily with whether revealing it would serve God's glory or merely feed the insatiable appetite for sensationalism that characterizes our modern age. I am not a man given to exaggeration or mystical fantasies. I am a diocesan priest who has served the Church for 34 years with methodical devotion to truth, reason, and the careful discernment that our tradition demands when confronting claims of the supernatural. But on a warm afternoon in September 2006, 1 month before Carlo Acutis would leave this world for eternity, I witnessed something in a small chapel in Milan that has fundamentally altered my understanding of how God manifests His presence among us, and more specifically, how He marks certain souls for extraordinary mission even while they still walk this earth. Before I describe what I saw emanating from the body of a 15-year-old boy kneeling in Eucharistic adoration, a phenomenon so undeniably supernatural that 3 other witnesses and I stood paralyzed in holy fear for what felt like an eternity but was actually 17 minutes by the chapel clock, I need to know something about you watching this right now. Have you ever witnessed something so far beyond natural explanation that speaking about it feels simultaneously like a sacred duty and a potential betrayal of the mystery you were privileged to observe? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because this testimony has waited nearly 2 decades to be shared, and it needs to reach hearts that are prepared to accept that God still performs wonders that defy our categories and exceed our capacity to fully comprehend. My name is Father Antonio Marino. I am 59 years old, and for the past 23 years I have served as the assistant pastor at the parish of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, a modest church in a working-class neighborhood where I minister to families who struggle with the ordinary challenges of modern urban life: unemployment, addiction, marital discord, the slow erosion of faith that occurs when people are ground down by the relentless machinery of economic survival. I am not assigned to some mystical monastery where visions and miracles are expected parts of the daily routine. I am a parish priest who spends most of my time helping elderly widows navigate bureaucratic systems, counseling couples on the brink of divorce, and trying to keep our youth group from dissolving entirely as smartphones and social media pull young people away from any form of traditional religious community. In this context of unglamorous, often frustrating pastoral ministry, my encounter with Carlo Acutis in the final weeks of his life stands out like a supernova in an otherwise ordinary sky. A concentrated burst of divine radiance that illuminated truths I had preached for decades but had never actually witnessed with such undeniable clarity. I first heard about Carlo Acutis in early September 2006, when his mother, Antonia, called our parish office asking if someone could bring communion to their home because her son was too weak from chemotherapy to attend Mass. At that time, I knew nothing about Carlo except what Antonia shared during that phone conversation. He was 15 years old, had been diagnosed with acute leukemia just weeks earlier, and was facing a prognosis that gave him perhaps months to live. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Carlo was very devoted to the Eucharist and would be deeply consoled by receiving communion at home during his illness. I agreed to visit the following afternoon, expecting one of the routine sick calls that comprise such a large portion of priestly ministry, bringing spiritual comfort to someone in physical suffering, offering prayers, perhaps discussing fear of death if the patient seemed open to such conversation. When I arrived at the Acutis apartment on Via Ariosto the next day, carrying the Blessed Sacrament in a small pyx, I was greeted by Antonia, who showed me to Carlo's room with the worried solicitude of a mother watching her only child slip away. What I encountered when I entered that room was so far from my expectations that I actually paused in the doorway, momentarily confused about whether I had somehow come to the wrong apartment. Instead of the pale, weakened, possibly frightened teenager I had anticipated, I saw a young man sitting at his computer desk, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, working intently on what appeared to be website code, his face showing obvious signs of illness and treatment, but his eyes blazing with an alertness and joy that seemed completely incongruous with his medical situation. "Father Antonio," he said when he noticed me, standing up immediately despite his obvious physical weakness and greeting me with a handshake that, while not strong, conveyed genuine warmth and pleasure at my visit. "I'm so happy you came. I've been looking forward to receiving Jesus in the Eucharist. Come, let me show you what I'm working on before we pray together." For the next 20 minutes, before we even began any formal prayer or spiritual conversation, Carlo enthusiastically showed me his website project documenting Eucharistic miracles from around the world. He explained the historical research behind each miracle, the scientific investigations that had been conducted, the theological significance of these supernatural events, all with the passion of a scholar 3 times his age and the engaging communication style of someone who genuinely wanted to share something he found infinitely fascinating. What struck me most forcefully during this initial encounter was not just his intelligence or his religious devotion, but the complete absence of self-pity or fear that I had come to expect from young people facing terminal illness. He spoke about his work on the website with the enthusiasm of someone planning years of future projects, not someone who might have only weeks left to live. "Carlo," I finally said, gently interrupting his explanation of a Eucharistic miracle in Lanciano, "your mother mentioned you'd like to receive communion. Should we prepare for that now?" His face lit up with such pure joy at the mention of the Eucharist that I felt my own somewhat routine approach to this sacrament suddenly feel inadequate, even slightly ashamed. This teenager was about to receive communion with more reverence and anticipation than I had probably brought to celebrating Mass earlier that morning. We prepared a small area of his room for the communion service, with Antonia bringing in a white cloth, candles, and a crucifix to create an appropriate setting. As I began the brief ritual, I noticed Carlo's entire demeanor shift into something I can only describe as profound recollection. His playful, energetic personality giving way to an interior focus that suggested someone entering into genuine mystical prayer. When I elevated the host and said, "Behold the Lamb of God," Carlo's response, "Lord, I am not worthy," was spoken with such conviction and such obvious consciousness of both his unworthiness and God's mercy that I felt tears prick my eyes unexpectedly. After he received communion, Carlo remained in silent prayer for nearly 15 minutes while I sat quietly nearby, praying my breviary but occasionally glancing at this remarkable young man whose faith seemed to emanate from him like warmth from a flame. It was during these 15 minutes of silence that I first noticed something unusual, though I initially dismissed it as a trick of the afternoon sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. There seemed to be a slight luminosity around Carlo's head and shoulders, a subtle golden glow that I attributed to the angle of the sun, and perhaps my own emotional state making me see things that weren't objectively there. When Carlo finally opened his eyes and smiled at me, he said something that I have replayed in my memory thousands of times in the years since. "Father, thank you for bringing Jesus to me. I know I don't have much time left on earth, but that doesn't make me sad because every day I receive the Eucharist brings me closer to seeing him face to face in heaven. And when I get there, I promise I'll pray for you especially, because you're going to witness something soon that will change how you understand God's presence in the world." At the time, I took his words as the kind of pious sentiment that devout young people sometimes express, touching but not particularly prophetic or significant beyond the moment. I had no idea that less than a month later, his words would prove to be literally, terrifyingly, gloriously true. During the month of September 2006, I visited Carlo 6 more times to bring him communion, and each visit deepened my sense that I was in the presence of someone whose interior life had reached levels of sanctity that I, despite 3 decades as a priest, had only encountered in reading about the great mystics and saints of church history. Our conversations during these visits ranged across an extraordinary breadth of topics: technology and its potential for evangelization, the crisis of faith among young people, the theological beauty of the Eucharist, the reality of heaven and hell, the importance of the Virgin Mary in spiritual life. What made these conversations remarkable was not just the depth of Carlo's understanding, which would have been impressive in a trained theologian, but the complete naturalness with which he integrated profound spiritual truths into discussion of everyday teenage life. During one visit in mid-September, I found Carlo weak from a recent chemotherapy session, lying in bed rather than sitting at his computer as usual. His mother had warned me that he was having a particularly difficult day physically, and I arrived prepared to keep the visit brief, perhaps just bringing communion and leaving him to rest. But when I entered his room, Carlo immediately brightened and insisted I stay to talk, saying he had been praying specifically for God to send me that day because he had something important to discuss. "Father Antonio," he began after receiving communion and spending several minutes in silent prayer, "can I ask you something that might sound strange?" When I encouraged him to speak freely, he continued, "Do you believe that God sometimes allows people to see the future, not to know everything, but to know specific things that they need to know for a reason?" I responded carefully, explaining the Church's teaching on prophecy and private revelation, emphasizing that while God certainly can grant knowledge of future events, we must always be cautious and discerning about such claims. Carlo nodded thoughtfully, then said something that sent a chill through me despite the warm September afternoon. "I've been having very clear dreams recently, Father. Dreams that I know are different from normal dreams because they feel more real than being awake. In these dreams I see my funeral. I see my body lying in state wearing jeans and sneakers because my mother wants to show that sanctity isn't about looking holy, but about living an ordinary life in an extraordinary way. I see thousands of people coming to pray at my tomb, young people especially, many of them crying but also smiling because they feel hope. And I see something else, Father. I see you, specifically you, standing in our church during one of my last days on earth. And you see something that you'll keep secret for many years because you won't know if anyone will believe you." I felt my throat tighten as he spoke, torn between pastoral concern that his illness might be causing disturbing dreams and a growing intuition that I was hearing something genuinely prophetic. "Carlo," I said gently, "what do I see in this dream of yours?" He looked at me with absolute seriousness, his 14-year-old face suddenly seeming ancient with wisdom beyond his years. "You see what God wanted Moses to see but couldn't because Moses would have died. You see the glory of God resting on someone who belongs completely to him. You see light, Father, pure light, the same light that transfigured Jesus on Mount Tabor. And when you see it, you'll understand that heaven isn't some abstract concept, but a real place that some souls already begin to inhabit even before death separates them from their bodies." I left his apartment that day profoundly shaken, uncertain whether to interpret his words as fever dreams of a sick teenager or as genuine mystical knowledge. I said nothing to anyone about our conversation, but I found myself praying more intensely than I had in years, asking God for wisdom to understand what was happening with this extraordinary young man whose physical health was deteriorating even as his spiritual vitality seemed to intensify. The answer to my prayers came on September 28, 2006, exactly 2 weeks before Carlo's death, in a way I could never have anticipated and still struggle to fully comprehend 19 years later. That afternoon, I received an urgent call from Antonia asking if I could come to the church rather than their apartment because Carlo had insisted on attending Mass in person despite being barely strong enough to walk. She explained that he had somehow convinced his doctors to give him permission for this one outing, and that they were bringing him to our parish for the 5 p.m. daily Mass. When I arrived at the church, I found Carlo already there, sitting in a wheelchair in the front pew, looking skeletal from the ravages of his disease, but with his eyes alive with anticipation. After Mass ended and the small congregation of daily communicants had left, Carlo asked his parents if he could spend some time in private prayer before the tabernacle. Antonia looked at me questioningly, and I assured her I would remain in the church to keep watch over Carlo, suggesting they could wait in the parish hall next door, and I would call them when he was ready to leave. After his parents departed, Carlo asked if I could help him from his wheelchair to kneel before the tabernacle. I hesitated, worried about his physical condition, but something in his expression told me this was profoundly important to him. I helped him kneel on the carpet before the altar, positioning myself nearby in case he needed assistance. 2 other people remained in the church, elderly Signora Benedetti, who came every evening to pray her rosary, and our parish maintenance worker, Luigi Moretti, who was replacing candles in the side chapel. Carlo knelt in absolute stillness, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the tabernacle with an intensity that made the air around him seem to vibrate with focused prayer. After about 10 minutes, I noticed that Signora Benedetti had stopped praying and was staring at Carlo with an expression of wonder on her weathered face. Following her gaze, I saw what had captured her attention and felt my breath catch in my throat. A soft golden light had begun to emanate from Carlo's body, specifically from the area of his chest, growing gradually brighter but never harsh or blinding. It was the quality of light I imagined dawn might have possessed in Eden before sin entered the world. Pure, warm, alive with presence rather than just illumination. The light expanded slowly, creating a luminous sphere around Carlo's kneeling form that seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with his breathing. I stood frozen, my mind racing through possible explanations, unusual sunlight, my own vision failing, some medical phenomenon related to Carlo's illness. But the light was undeniably real, undeniably supernatural, and undeniably emanating from Carlo himself, or more accurately, from something within him or surrounding him that responded to his prayer. I glanced at Signora Benedetti, whose face was wet with tears, her rosary beads frozen in her hands. Across the church, Luigi had also stopped his work and stood motionless, witnessing the same phenomenon. We were not experiencing individual hallucinations. We were collectively seeing something objectively present, something that transcended natural explanation. The manifestation lasted approximately 17 minutes. I know this precisely because I instinctively looked at my watch when it began and checked again when it ended. The priest in me already understanding that I would need to document this experience with as much factual precision as possible. During those 17 minutes, the church filled with a fragrance I can only describe as similar to incense, but infinitely more beautiful, more complex, carrying within it suggestions of flowers that don't exist in our earthly gardens. When the light finally began to fade, diminishing gradually the same way it had appeared, Carlo remained kneeling for another minute before slowly opening his eyes. He turned his head slightly toward me and smiled with such profound peace that I knew immediately he was aware of what had just occurred. That this manifestation had not been something happening to him without his knowledge, but rather a visible expression of an interior reality he was fully conscious of experiencing. I helped him back into his wheelchair, my hands trembling. Before I could find words to ask what had just happened, Carlo spoke first. "You saw it, didn't you, Father? I told you that you would see the glory of God. This is what happens when you receive Jesus in the Eucharist with your whole heart. He transforms you from the inside out. Sometimes that transformation is invisible, but God wanted you to see it today, so you would know with absolute certainty that the Eucharist is not a symbol or a metaphor. It's really Him, body, blood, soul, and divinity." Signora Benedetti approached us, her elderly face radiant with awe. "Father, what did we just witness? I've been coming to this church for 43 years and I've never seen anything like that." Before I could respond, Luigi joined us, visibly shaken, repeating over and over, "The boy was glowing, Father. I saw it with my own eyes. The boy was glowing." Carlo looked at each of us with gentle compassion, as if we were children who needed reassurance about something wonderful they'd experienced but didn't fully understand. "Don't be afraid," he said softly. "You saw what God wanted you to see, and someday each of you will need to tell others about this to help them believe that God is real, that heaven is real, that saints are still among us even in our modern world that thinks it has outgrown miracles." I called Antonia and Andrea to return to the church, and as we prepared to take Carlo home, I pulled Antonia aside briefly. "Something extraordinary happened during Carlo's prayer," I began, uncertain how to explain what we had witnessed. She placed her hand on my arm gently and said, "I know, Father. Things like this have been happening around Carlo for months now, especially when he receives communion. My husband and I have witnessed similar phenomena. We haven't spoken about it publicly because we don't want Carlo to become some kind of spectacle, but we know that God is manifesting His presence through our son in ways that defy natural explanation. That evening, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed at the rectory replaying those 17 minutes over and over in my mind, examining every detail, questioning my own sanity, praying for understanding. The rational part of my brain that had been trained in seminary to be skeptical of extraordinary claims fought against the undeniable testimony of my own eyes and the corroborating witnesses who had seen the same phenomenon. I knew I had witnessed something genuinely supernatural, but I had no framework for understanding what it meant or what I was supposed to do with this knowledge. The next morning, I called Signora Benedetti and Luigi separately to discuss what we had witnessed. Both confirmed every detail of my own experience: the golden light, the duration, the fragrance, the pulsing quality of the illumination. We agreed that we needed to maintain discretion about what we had seen until we could discern more clearly what God intended us to do with this extraordinary testimony. None of us wanted to create a sensation or subject Carlo to unwanted attention during his final days. If this revelation is stirring something in your spirit right now, if you're beginning to understand that the supernatural is not confined to ancient history, but breaks through into our modern world when God chooses to reveal His glory, then pause right now and hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to share in the remaining parts of this testimony will challenge everything you thought you knew about how God manifests His presence among us. And in the comments below, I want you to share. Have you ever witnessed something that you knew was divine but struggled to find words to describe? Your testimony might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear to recognize the miracles occurring all around us every single day. The 2 weeks between Carlo's visitation to our church and his death on October 12, 2006, passed with agonizing speed as I watched this extraordinary young man's physical condition deteriorate, while his spiritual radiance seemed only to intensify. I visited him every other day during this period, always bringing the Eucharist, and each visit reinforced my growing conviction that I was in the presence of someone who was already living more in heaven than on earth. Someone whose soul had become so transparent to God's grace that the boundary between natural and supernatural had become almost non-existent. During a visit on October 3rd, 9 days before his death, I found Carlo propped up in bed working on his laptop, despite being so weak he could barely lift his arms. When I expressed concern that he was exhausting himself, he smiled and said, "Father, I need to finish organizing my website files and documentation so that after I'm gone, someone can continue updating the Eucharistic Miracles exhibition. This work is too important to die with me. Young people need to see that science and faith aren't enemies, that the greatest miracles have been investigated by scientists who confirmed supernatural events that can't be explained by natural laws." I helped him receive communion that afternoon, and during his Thanksgiving prayer, I witnessed a less dramatic but still clearly visible phenomenon. A subtle luminosity around his face, almost like a halo in medieval religious paintings, except completely real and natural looking, as if his skin itself had become slightly translucent, allowing an interior light to shine through. When he finished praying and opened his eyes, he noticed my expression and understood immediately what I had been observing. "It's getting closer, Father," he said quietly. "Heaven, I mean. I can almost see through the veil that separates this world from the next. Sometimes during prayer, I see Jesus so clearly that I forget I'm still in my bedroom in Milan. He's shown me beautiful things about what's waiting for me, gardens that make the most beautiful places on earth look ugly by comparison, music that makes the greatest symphonies sound like noise, joy so intense that your heart feels like it might explode from happiness. And He's shown me something else too, Father. He's shown me that my mission doesn't end when I die. It actually begins then. From heaven, I'm going to help young people all over the world discover that God loves them, that the Eucharist is the greatest treasure in the universe, that they can be saints even while living normal modern lives." I listened to him speak about heaven with the confident familiarity of someone describing their hometown, and I found myself simultaneously believing every word, while also struggling with the cognitive dissonance of hearing such things from a teenager who should have been worried about school exams and soccer games, not calmly discussing his imminent death and posthumous mission. "Carlo," I asked carefully, "are you afraid at all? Even just a little. It would be completely natural and understandable if you were." He considered my question seriously before responding. "I'm not afraid of death itself, Father, because I know what's waiting for me. but I am a little sad about leaving my parents because I know how much pain my death will cause them. I pray for them constantly, asking God to give them the grace to accept my death as part of His plan, and to find comfort in knowing that I'm going somewhere infinitely better than even the happiest life on earth could ever be. I've told my mother that I want to be buried in Assisi, in jeans and sneakers, because I want people to see that you don't have to wear robes and look ancient to be a saint. Saints can wear normal clothes and like normal things and still give everything to God. During this conversation, Antonia entered the room carrying soup for Carlo, and I saw her face crumple briefly with grief before she composed herself and smiled at her son. The courage both of them displayed, Carlo facing his own death and Antonia facing the loss of her only child, was one of the most powerful testimonies to authentic faith I had ever witnessed. This was not the superficial emotional religiosity that characterizes so much of modern spirituality. This was tested, refined faith, forged in the crucible of real suffering and real sacrifice. On October 8th, 4 days before Carlo's death, I arrived for my visit to find the apartment filled with family members who had come to say goodbye. Carlo's condition had deteriorated significantly since my previous visit. He could no longer sit up without assistance. His skin had taken on a translucent, almost ethereal quality, and his voice had weakened to barely above a whisper. Yet when he saw me enter his room carrying the Blessed Sacrament, his eyes lit up with unmistakable joy. That day's communion was one of the most sacred moments I have experienced in 34 years of priesthood. The room fell completely silent as I elevated the host, and in that silence, I swear I could hear, or perhaps feel is a more accurate word, the presence of heaven pressing close to earth, the veil between worlds thinning to near transparency. When Carlo received the Eucharist, a single tear rolled down his cheek, and he whispered so quietly that I had to lean close to hear, "Jesus, I love you so much. Thank you for coming to me. I'm ready to come home to you whenever you call me." After Carlo had finished his Thanksgiving prayer, he asked me to stay and talk with him privately. His family members graciously left the room, though I saw the reluctance in Antonia's eyes at leaving her son even for a few minutes, knowing that each moment together might be their last. When we were alone, Carlo gestured for me to come closer to his bed, and when I leaned in, he spoke with surprising strength and clarity, given his physical condition. "Father Antonio, I need to tell you something important before I die. Something that only you can know right now because God has chosen you specifically for this task. Do you remember the light you saw when I was praying in the church? That wasn't just a special grace for that one moment. That light has been with me, inside me, growing stronger since I was a small child. Every time I receive the Eucharist, that light gets brighter because Jesus himself is light, and when he comes to live inside someone who welcomes him completely, his light begins to transform that person from the inside out." He paused to catch his breath, and I waited patiently, sensing that what he was about to tell me was of crucial importance. "Father, when I die, and it will be soon, within days, that light is going to manifest one more time, and it's going to be even more powerful than what you saw in the church. You're going to be there when it happens. God has shown me this in prayer. And Father, you're going to be frightened at first because the light will be so bright, so obviously supernatural, that you'll wonder if anyone will believe you when you testify to what you witnessed. You're going to be tempted to keep silent about it, to rationalize it away, to convince yourself that it was just your grief and emotion making you see things that weren't really there." I felt a chill run through me as he spoke, because his words were describing exactly the kind of internal struggle I knew I would face if I witnessed something too extraordinary to be easily accepted. "But Father," Carlo continued, gripping my hand with surprising strength, "you must not remain silent forever. God is allowing you to witness these things not just for your own faith, but so that someday, when the time is right, you can testify to others about what you saw. Young people especially need to hear this testimony because they've been taught that faith is just psychological comfort, that miracles don't really happen, that heaven is just a metaphor. You're going to help prove to them that it's all real, that God is real, that miracles still happen, that heaven is an actual place that some souls are already so close to that heaven's light begins to shine through them even before death. "How will I know when the right time comes to speak?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly despite my attempts to maintain priestly composure. Carlo smiled, that radiant smile that had characterized all our interactions despite his terrible illness. "You'll know, Father. God will make it unmistakably clear. But it won't be immediate. You're going to carry this secret in your heart for many years, and during those years, the weight of what you witnessed will slowly transform your own priesthood. You'll become a different kind of priest, one who speaks about the Eucharist and about heaven, not from theological study alone, but from having witnessed with your own eyes the glory that awaits those who give everything to God." We talked for another hour that afternoon, discussing everything from the details of how he wanted his funeral celebrated to his hopes for how his website about Eucharistic miracles would continue reaching people after his death. He made me promise that I would check on his parents regularly after he died, knowing that their grief would be overwhelming. He also asked me to pray for the doctors and nurses who had cared for him during his illness, mentioning each by name and describing specific ways they had shown him kindness that went beyond professional duty. When I finally left his apartment that evening, I knew with terrible certainty that I would not see Carlo alive many more times. The angel of death was hovering close now. I could sense it in the peculiar quality of the air in his room, in the way time seemed to be simultaneously speeding up and slowing down, in the expression of resigned sorrow on Antonia's face as she walked me to the door. "Father," she said as I was leaving, "thank you for being such a faithful presence to Carlo during these final weeks. Your visits and bringing the Eucharist have meant more to him than you can possibly know." "Signora Acutis," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "It is I who should be thanking you and your husband for allowing me to know Carlo. I have learned more about authentic sanctity from your 15-year-old son than from decades of theological study. He is a gift to the Church, and I believe his influence will continue long after his death." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and I left the apartment carrying a weight of knowledge and responsibility that I understood I would bear for years to come. On October 11th, 2006, the day before Carlo's death, I received a call at 6:30 in the morning from Andrea Acutis. His voice was steady, but I could hear the controlled panic underneath his measured words. "Father Antonio, the doctors say Carlo has perhaps hours remaining. He's asked specifically for you to come and administer the sacrament of the sick. Can you come now?" I dressed hurriedly, grabbed my ritual book and the holy oils, and drove through the early morning Milan traffic with a heavy heart, praying the entire way for strength to minister to this extraordinary young man in his final hours and for his parents who were about to endure every parent's worst nightmare. When I arrived at the apartment, I found it filled with quiet activity, family members speaking in hushed tones, the parish priest from Carlo's childhood church who had arrived before me, medical equipment that had been brought in to make Carlo's final hours as comfortable as possible. Carlo was conscious, but barely. His breathing labored, his body clearly in the final stages of shutting down. Yet when I entered his room and he saw me carrying the oils for anointing, a smile flickered across his face and he whispered, "Father Antonio, thank you for coming. I'm almost home. I administered the sacrament of the sick with all the reverence and care that this final sacrament deserves, anointing his forehead and hands while praying the ancient prayers that the Church has used for centuries to commend dying souls to God's mercy." After the anointing, Carlo asked if I could give him viaticum, the final communion, literally meaning food for the journey. I prepared the small piece of consecrated host I had brought with me, and as I placed it on Carlo's tongue, something extraordinary happened. Despite his extreme weakness, Carlo's face became animated with a joy so intense it seemed to illuminate him from within. He closed his eyes to pray, and during the 5 minutes of silence that followed, every person in that room, and there were perhaps 8 of us, including family members and myself, felt an almost tangible presence of peace descend over the space, as if heaven itself had drawn near to receive one of its children. When Carlo opened his eyes after his communion, he looked at each person in the room individually, as if memorizing their faces or perhaps imprinting a final blessing on each of them. When his eyes met mine, he mouthed the words, "Remember what I told you." before his exhaustion forced him back into semi-consciousness. I understood he was referring to his prophecy about the light that would manifest at his death, and about my responsibility to eventually testify to what I would witness. The parish priest and I remained at the apartment throughout the morning, alternating between praying in Carlo's room and sitting with his parents in the living room, offering what comfort we could to parents who were living through the nightmare of watching their child die. Around noon, Antonia asked if we could pray the rosary together at Carlo's bedside, and as we began the first decade, Carlo briefly regained full consciousness. "Mama," he whispered, "don't cry. I'm going somewhere so beautiful that if you could see it for even 1 second, you'd understand why I'm so happy to go there. And I'm not leaving you, not really. I'll be closer to you from heaven than I ever was on earth." These would be Carlo's last fully coherent words to his mother. As the afternoon progressed, he drifted deeper into unconsciousness, his breathing becoming more irregular, the physical signs of approaching death becoming unmistakable to those of us who had witnessed death before. At around 4:00 p.m., the other priest needed to return to his parish for evening mass, so he said his goodbyes to the family and departed, leaving me as the sole clerical presence as night approached. Around 6:00 p.m., as the October sun was beginning to set over Milan, casting long shadows through the windows of Carlo's bedroom, his breathing changed in a way that I recognized immediately. The death rattle had begun, that distinctive sound that indicates death is imminent, usually within hours or less. I quietly alerted his parents that the end was very near, and they took their positions on either side of their son's bed, each holding one of his hands, tears flowing silently down both their faces. I began praying the prayers for the dying, those ancient, beautiful Catholic prayers that commend the departing soul to God's mercy and call upon all the angels and saints to accompany the soul on its journey from earth to eternity. Go forth, Christian soul, from this world, in the name of God, the Almighty Father who created you, in the name of Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, who suffered for you, in the name of the Holy Spirit, who was poured out upon you. As I prayed, I noticed something beginning to happen in the room. Something that started so subtly that at first I thought it might be just the effect of the setting sun, but which quickly became so obvious that it could not be explained by any natural cause. A soft golden light had begun to appear around Carlo's body, originating from the center of his chest, the region of his heart, and gradually expanding outward in gentle waves. Unlike the phenomenon I had witnessed in the church 2 weeks earlier, this light was significantly brighter, more intense, and it carried with it a warmth that was not physical heat, but rather a spiritual warmth, a sense of overwhelming love and peace that filled the entire room. Andrea and Antonia both gasped audibly when they saw the light, but neither moved from their positions at their son's side. Antonia whispered, "Dio mio," "My God," over and over, while Andrea simply stared at his son with an expression of awe mixed with grief. I continued praying, my voice shaking now, because I understood that I was witnessing exactly what Carlo had prophesied to me days earlier, the final, most powerful manifestation of the light that had been growing within him throughout his life. The light continued to intensify, becoming so bright that the electric lights in the room seemed dim by comparison. Yet it was not harsh or painful to look at. Instead, it had the quality of dawn light, gentle and life-giving. And I had the distinct impression that we were not seeing Carlo's light, but rather seeing through Carlo to the divine light that dwelt within him, that had been nurturing his soul throughout his life and was now preparing to carry that soul home to its eternal source. At exactly 6:45 p.m., I know the time precisely because I checked my watch when it happened, Carlo took his final breath. It was not a struggle or a gasping. It was simply a gentle exhalation, as if he were releasing a sigh of relief or contentment. And in that exact moment, the light that had been emanating from his body suddenly intensified to a brilliance that should have been blinding but somehow wasn't. And then, just as suddenly, it began to recede, pulling back toward his body and then fading gradually, like the way daylight fades at dusk, not disappearing instantly but slowly, gently giving way to darkness. The entire manifestation of light, from its first subtle appearance to its final fading, lasted approximately 40 minutes, with the most intense phase occurring in the final minute of Carlo's life and the 2 minutes immediately following his death, when the light had completely disappeared, leaving only the normal electric illumination of the bedroom. The three of us who had witnessed this extraordinary event sat in stunned silence, unable to find words adequate to express what we had just experienced. Antonia broke the silence first, her voice thick with tears, but also with something that sounded remarkably like joy. "He's with Jesus now. He's finally home. Did you see, Antonio? Did you see how God came to take him personally? That light was heaven coming to meet earth, wasn't it?" I nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak, while Andrea sat motionless, tears streaming down his face, his hand still gripping his son's now lifeless hand. For the next hour, I remained with the family as they began the awful necessary tasks that follow death, calling the funeral home, notifying family members, beginning to plan funeral arrangements. But my mind was reeling, replaying those 40 minutes over and over, examining every detail, trying to comprehend what I had witnessed. I had seen proof positive that Carlo Acutis had been a soul so filled with God's presence that heaven's light had literally shone through him, becoming visible to physical eyes in the moments surrounding his death. Before I left the Acutis apartment late that evening, Antonia pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Father," she said, her eyes red from crying but her voice steady. "What we witnessed tonight, the light. I need to know that I'm not crazy, that we really saw what I think we saw." I took her hands in mine and looked directly into her eyes. "Signora Acutis, you are not crazy. We witnessed something genuinely supernatural, something that I have no natural explanation for. That light was real, it was objective, and it was a visible manifestation of the sanctity of your son's soul and God's presence within him." She nodded, relief flooding her features. "Will you tell people about this, Father? Will you testify to what you saw?" I hesitated before answering, because I honestly didn't know yet what God was calling me to do with this knowledge. "I don't know yet when or how I should speak about this publicly," I finally responded. "But I promise you that I will never deny what I saw, and if God makes it clear that I should give public testimony, I will do so regardless of whether people believe me or not." That night, back in my room at the rectory, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that light, radiant and golden, emanating from the body of a 15-year-old boy whose faith had been so pure, so complete, that God had chosen to mark his departure from this world with a sign that unmistakably proclaimed, "This soul belongs to me, and I am bringing him home." The days immediately following Carlo's death passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, pastoral duties, and my own internal struggle to process what I had witnessed. I attended the funeral mass on October 14th at the parish of Santa Maria Segreta in Milan, where hundreds of people gathered to mourn a teenager who had touched far more lives than anyone realized during his brief 15 years on earth. As I sat in that church watching young people Carlo's age weep for their friend, parents embrace the Acutis couple with genuine sorrow, and teachers speak tearfully about a student whose faith had challenged and inspired them, I carried within me the secret knowledge of the supernatural light that had marked his death. A secret that felt like a burning coal in my heart, painful to hold but impossible to release. During the homily, the celebrant spoke beautifully about Carlo's devotion to the Eucharist, his work documenting Eucharistic miracles, his joy despite his suffering, his modern approach to evangelization through technology. Everything said was true and moving, but I found myself wanting to stand up and shout to everyone present, "You don't understand. This wasn't just an unusually pious teenager. This was a saint, someone so filled with God's presence that heaven's light literally shone through his body. I saw it with my own eyes, but I remained silent, held back by prudence, by fear of being dismissed as an emotionally overwrought priest, and by my own uncertainty about whether the time was right to reveal what I had witnessed. In the weeks following the funeral, I found myself wrestling daily with the question of whether I should speak publicly about the light. I consulted with my spiritual director, an elderly Jesuit priest who had guided my conscience for over a decade. When I described to him everything I had witnessed, the light in the church during Carlo's prayer, and the more intense manifestation at the moment of death. He listened carefully without interruption, then sat in silence for several minutes before responding. "Antonio," he finally said, "the Church has centuries of wisdom regarding private revelations and supernatural phenomena. The pattern has always been this: when God grants someone a vision or allows them to witness a miracle, the immediate response should be prayer, discernment, and prudent silence. Not permanent silence necessarily, but initial silence that allows time for proper discernment and prevents the witness from becoming the center of attention rather than God's action being the focus. You must ask yourself, who would benefit from you speaking now about what you witnessed? Would it serve God's glory and help souls, or would it create controversy and distraction that might actually obscure the authentic sanctity of Carlo's life?" His words resonated deeply with my own instincts, and I decided to maintain public silence about the supernatural light, while privately documenting every detail of what I had witnessed. I began keeping a detailed journal, recording not only my own observations but also the testimonies of Antonia and Andrea, who had both witnessed the same phenomenon and could corroborate my account if ever the time came to speak publicly. During this period of enforced silence, something unexpected began to happen. My own priesthood underwent a profound transformation. The experience of witnessing visible evidence of God's presence in Carlo had shattered what I now recognized as a subtle skepticism that had crept into my ministry over the years. I had not stopped believing in Catholic teaching about the Eucharist, miracles, or heaven. But somewhere along the way, these had become abstract theological concepts rather than vivid realities. Having seen with my own eyes the light of God shining through a teenage boy's body, I could no longer approach these mysteries with intellectual detachment. My preaching changed dramatically. When I spoke about the Eucharist, I no longer relied solely on theological explanations of transubstantiation. I spoke with the passion of someone who had seen proof that Christ is truly present, body and blood, soul and divinity, in the consecrated host. When I consoled grieving families at funerals, I no longer offered platitudes about heaven as a comforting belief. I spoke with conviction about heaven as a real place that I knew, with certainty born of witness, awaited those who died in God's friendship. Parishioners noticed the change in my ministry, several commenting that my homilies had become more alive or that I seemed to celebrate Mass with renewed reverence. In 2007, about 8 months after Carlo's death, I received an unexpected phone call from Antonia Acutis. She explained that she and Andrea had been contacted by the Archbishop of Milan regarding the possibility of opening a formal investigation into Carlo's life with an eye toward potential beatification. As part of this process, witnesses who could testify to Carlo's virtuous life and any possible miracles associated with him were being identified and interviewed. She asked if I would be willing to give testimony about my pastoral interactions with Carlo during his final month of life. I agreed immediately, seeing this as potentially the providential moment when I would be able to share, at least with church authorities, what I had witnessed. Several weeks later, I was summoned to the diocesan offices for a formal interview with the tribunal investigating Carlo's cause. The interview was conducted with canonical precision. I was placed under oath, reminded of the seriousness of providing false testimony, and questioned exhaustively about every detail of my interactions with Carlo. When I reached the point in my testimony where I needed to describe the supernatural light, I hesitated briefly, knowing that what I was about to say would be met with intense scrutiny. But then I remembered Carlo's words to me, that I must not remain silent about what I had witnessed, and I described, in meticulous detail, both the phenomenon in the church on September 28th and the more powerful manifestation at the moment of his death on October 12th. The tribunal members listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, their faces revealing neither skepticism nor credulity, maintaining the careful neutrality required in such investigations. When I finished my account, the lead investigator asked several pointed questions. Had I been the only witness? No, Signora Benedetti and Luigi Moretti had also seen the church incident, and Andrea and Antonia Acutis had witnessed the death manifestation. Could there have been any natural explanation for what I saw? I had considered every possibility, unusual lighting, medical phenomena, even my own fatigue or emotional state, and none could account for what all witnesses had observed. Was I certain the light emanated from Carlo's body and was not simply unusual illumination in the room? Absolutely certain. The light originated from his chest area and expanded outward, and it was clearly supernatural in character. After the interview concluded, the lead investigator thanked me for my testimony and explained that all evidence gathered would be carefully evaluated as part of the formal process. He emphasized that I should continue to maintain discretion about the details of my testimony, as premature publicity could compromise the integrity of the investigation. I agreed readily, relieved to have finally shared the full truth with church authorities while respecting the wisdom of continued public silence. The years that followed were a period of patient waiting. I continued my parish ministry, now enriched and deepened by what I had witnessed, while occasionally hearing reports about the progress of Carlo's cause for beatification. In 2013, I learned that the diocesan phase of the investigation had been completed and the cause had been forwarded to Rome. In 2018, I received news that Pope Francis had recognized Carlo as having lived the Christian virtues to a heroic degree, granting him the title Venerable. Each milestone in Carlo's cause brought me a mixture of joy and renewed questioning about when, if ever, I should speak publicly about the light. I had testified truthfully to church authorities, fulfilling what I saw as my canonical duty, but Carlo's words about eventually needing to tell others what I had witnessed continued to echo in my conscience. Was he referring only to my formal testimony to the tribunal, or did he mean something broader? A public witness that would help ordinary faithful understand the reality of sanctity in our modern world? The answer came in October 2020, 14 years after Carlo's death, when I watched via live stream as Pope Francis beatified Carlo Acutis in a ceremony in Assisi. Seeing Carlo officially recognized as blessed, watching thousands of young people celebrate this teenager who had been one of them, who wore jeans and sneakers, who loved technology and video games, who had lived an ordinary life in an extraordinary way, I felt a clear interior conviction that the time had come to break my 14-year public silence about the light. That evening, after the beatification ceremony, I spent 3 hours in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament in our parish church, asking God for final confirmation that I should speak publicly about what I had witnessed. During that prayer, I experienced what I can only describe as an interior locution, not an audible voice but a clear communication impressed on my heart. The time of silence has served its purpose. Now is the time of witness. Speak what you have seen, that young hearts may believe. The following week, I contacted the postulator of Carlo's cause, explaining that I had witnessed supernatural phenomena related to Carlo that I had previously shared only with church tribunals, but now felt called to make public. The postulator, after consulting with his superiors, granted permission for me to share my testimony publicly, with the understanding that I would continue to cooperate fully with any ongoing investigations, and would frame my account appropriately as personal witness rather than official church pronouncement. In November 2020, I was invited to speak at a youth conference in Milan focused on Blessed Carlo Acutis as a model of young sanctity for the digital age. It was there, before an audience of approximately 800 young people, that I first publicly described the light I had witnessed emanating from Carlo's body in the church and at the moment of his death. The silence in that auditorium as I spoke was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop as I described the golden luminosity, the warmth, the sense of heaven pressing close to earth, the unmistakable reality of witnessing something supernatural. When I finished my testimony, I braced myself for skeptical questions or challenges to my credibility. Instead, the first person to speak was a young woman of about 20 who stood up with tears streaming down her face. "Father, thank you for finally telling us this. I've been praying to Carlo for 2 years, asking him to help me believe that heaven is real and not just a comforting story we tell ourselves. What you just described, it gives me hope that faith isn't just wishful thinking, that God really does do miracles, that Carlo really is in heaven praying for us." Her words, and the dozens of similar responses I received from young people that day and in subsequent months, confirmed that Carlo had been right. My witness was needed not for my own sake, but for others, especially young people who desperately needed concrete reasons to believe that the supernatural realities of our faith are true. The response to my public testimony about the light was both overwhelming and, in many ways, unexpected. Within weeks of my presentation at the youth conference, I began receiving invitations to speak at parishes, schools, and conferences throughout Italy and eventually across Europe. Young people especially seemed hungry to hear firsthand testimony from someone who had witnessed undeniable proof of the supernatural, someone who could say with absolute certainty, "I saw God's glory with my own eyes, and it was real." But along with the positive responses came inevitable skepticism and questions. Medical professionals suggested the light might have been some kind of biological phenomenon related to death, perhaps bioluminescence or unusual electrical activity in the dying brain. Skeptics proposed that grief and emotion had caused me to misinterpret normal lighting conditions as supernatural. Some critics even suggested that my testimony was a cynical attempt to enhance Carlo's cause for canonization through fabricated miracle claims. I responded to all questions and criticisms with patient reiteration of the facts. Multiple witnesses had observed the same phenomenon on multiple occasions. The light had characteristics that could not be explained by any known natural process, and my testimony had been given under oath to church authorities years before I spoke publicly, eliminating any motive of self-promotion or manipulation of public opinion. I also emphasized that I had nothing to gain personally from this testimony and everything to lose in terms of professional credibility. Priests who claim to see supernatural lights risk being dismissed as superstitious or mentally unstable. During this period, something remarkable began to happen. Other witnesses of supernatural phenomena related to Blessed Carlo started coming forward with their own testimonies. A nurse who had cared for Carlo during his hospitalizations reported having seen a soft glow around him during particularly intense moments of pain when he was praying rather than requesting additional morphine. Teachers from his school described instances when Carlo seemed to have knowledge of classmates' personal struggles that he couldn't have known through natural means, knowledge that led him to offer specific help or encouragement exactly when it was needed. Most significantly, Signora Benedetti and Luigi Moretti, the two other witnesses to the church incident, both confirmed publicly that they had witnessed exactly what I had described. Signora Benedetti, now in her 80s, gave an interview to a Catholic newspaper in which she stated, "I have attended daily Mass for 60 years, and I have never seen anything like what I witnessed that September evening in 2006. The light that surrounded that holy boy was not of this world. It was heaven itself becoming visible for a brief time, so that we would know God's saints still walk among us." In 2021, I was invited to participate in a formal ecclesiastical investigation examining reported miracles attributed to Blessed Carlo's intercession. One case under investigation involved a young Brazilian boy who had been born with a severe pancreatic malformation that doctors said was incompatible with life. The child's mother had prayed intensely to Carlo, asking his intercession, and the boy had inexplicably healed completely. Medical experts examining the case could find no natural explanation for the healing, and the case was being considered as the miracle necessary for Carlo's canonization. During my participation in this investigation, I was asked by the medical board whether there were any precedents in the lives of other saints for the phenomenon I had witnessed, saints whose bodies had emitted light either during life or at death. I explained that while such phenomena are rare, they are not unprecedented in hagiography. Saints like Philip Neri, Joseph of Cupertino, and several others were reported by credible witnesses to have exhibited supernatural luminosity during moments of intense prayer or ecstasy. The light I witnessed from Carlo fit within this established pattern of mystical phenomena associated with authentic sanctity. What I found most compelling about the ongoing investigations into Carlo's life and intercession was that the phenomenon of light I had witnessed was increasingly being understood not as an isolated anomaly, but as part of a broader pattern of supernatural signs that had surrounded Carlo's entire existence. His mother shared with investigators that even as a small child, Carlo had shown signs of unusual spiritual sensitivity, speaking about guardian angels as if he could see them, expressing theological insights that seemed far beyond his years, exhibiting a devotion to the Eucharist that was spontaneous rather than the result of parental pressure. One story Antonia shared particularly struck me. When Carlo was 7 years old, after receiving his first communion, he had asked his mother why people in the church seemed unaware that Jesus was right there in the tabernacle. "Mama," he had said, "if they really understood who was in that little house, they would never want to leave the church. They would stay all day and all night just to be close to him." This wasn't the observation of a child reciting religious education lessons. It was the testimony of someone who genuinely perceived Christ's presence in the Eucharist with an immediacy and conviction that most adults never achieve. As more of these stories emerged during the investigative process, I began to understand that the light I had witnessed was not God arbitrarily choosing to perform a spectacular miracle to impress witnesses. Rather, it was the natural, or perhaps more accurately, supernatural, outward manifestation of an interior reality that had characterized Carlo's entire life. He had been so completely transparent to God's presence, so thoroughly transformed by grace, that at certain moments of intense prayer, or at the moment of death when the soul separates from the body, that interior light became briefly visible to physical eyes. This understanding deepened my appreciation for the Eucharist in ways I struggle to articulate. Carlo's entire spirituality had been Eucharistic-centered. His daily Mass attendance, his hours of adoration before the tabernacle, his work documenting Eucharistic miracles, all of it had been motivated by his absolute conviction that the Eucharist was not a symbol or a metaphor, but the literal presence of Christ, body and blood, soul and divinity. And the light that I had seen emanating from him was, in a very real sense, Christ's light shining through someone who had so completely welcomed him through frequent reception of Holy Communion that there was almost no barrier remaining between Carlo's humanity and Christ's divinity dwelling within him. In my preaching and teaching, since publicly sharing my testimony, I have tried to help people understand this connection between the Eucharist and sanctity, between receiving Christ in communion and being transformed into living tabernacles that carry his presence into the world. What I witnessed in Carlo, I often tell audiences, is what theoretically could happen to any of us if we received the Eucharist with the same faith, love, and devotion that he brought to every communion. We are all called to become so transparent to Christ's presence that his light shines through us, even if for most of us that light remains invisible to physical eyes. Carlo was simply so advanced in holiness that what happens invisibly in every soul that worthily receives communion became briefly, miraculously visible in him. This message has resonated particularly powerfully with young people who are searching for authentic spiritual experiences in a secular world that tells them religious faith is nothing more than emotional comfort or cultural tradition. In an age where everything is questioned and empirical evidence is demanded, my testimony that I witnessed with my own eyes undeniable proof of the supernatural has provided an anchor point for faith that many young people desperately needed. I have received hundreds of letters and emails from young adults who tell me that hearing my testimony helped them return to the church after years of doubt or indifference. One young man from Germany wrote, "Father Antonio, I had decided that Catholicism was just ancient mythology until I heard your testimony about the light you saw from Blessed Carlo. The fact that a credible witness in our modern era saw something so undeniably supernatural made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about reality. I've started attending Mass again, and I'm trying to approach the Eucharist the way Carlo did, as an encounter with the living God, not just a ritual." These testimonies from young people have convinced me that my 14 years of silence followed by public witness were both part of God's plan. The silence allowed the Church's formal investigative process to proceed without the complications of media attention and public controversy. It also gave me time to process what I had witnessed, to mature in my own understanding of its significance, and to prepare spiritually for the responsibility of public testimony. When I finally spoke, I did so not as a young priest seeking attention, but as a mature minister with decades of experience, lending credibility to an account that might have been dismissed if I had shared it immediately after the emotionally intense experience of witnessing Carlo's death. Moreover, The timing of my public testimony coinciding with Carlo's beatification meant that my witness was received within a context where the Church had already officially recognized his heroic virtue. I was not making wild claims about a random teenager. I was providing supporting testimony about someone whose sanctity had been formally authenticated through the Church's rigorous investigative process. This context helped many people accept my testimony as credible, rather than dismissing it as religious delusion. In 2022, I was granted a sabbatical from my parish duties to work on a comprehensive written account of my experiences with Carlo, including the supernatural phenomena I witnessed. This project, undertaken with the full approval and encouragement of my bishop, resulted in a book that has been translated into multiple languages and has helped spread awareness of Carlo's sanctity and intercession to audiences far beyond the Catholic subculture. The book carefully documents not only my own testimony, but also corroborating accounts from other witnesses and places the phenomena I observed within the broader context of Catholic mystical theology and the lives of the saints. Now, 19 years after witnessing the light emanate from Carlo Acutis' body in those final sacred moments of his earthly life, I find myself living in a reality I could never have imagined when I was ordained as a young priest 34 years ago. My ministry has been completely transformed by those 40 minutes in a Milan apartment bedroom when heaven touched earth in such an undeniable way that I was forever changed as a witness to God's glory. What began as a secret burden carried in silence has become a public testimony that has reached millions of people worldwide, particularly young people who desperately needed to hear that the supernatural realities of our faith are not ancient myths, but present realities that God continues to manifest to those with eyes to see. The most profound impact of my decision to break my silence has been the countless testimonies I have received from people who report experiencing spiritual renewal or conversion after hearing about the light I witnessed. A young woman from Poland wrote to me, describing how she had been planning to leave the Church entirely, convinced that Catholicism was incompatible with modern scientific thinking, until she attended a conference where I shared my testimony. "Father Antonio," she wrote, "when you described seeing that supernatural light with your own eyes, something broke open inside me. I realized I had been demanding that God prove himself to me according to my terms, while simultaneously refusing to consider evidence of his activity that didn't fit my materialistic worldview. Your testimony helped me understand that reality is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than my narrow rationalism had allowed. I'm back at Mass now, and I'm approaching the Eucharist with new reverence and wonder. Stories like hers arrive regularly in my email inbox and postal mail, each one a confirmation that Carlo was right when he told me I would need to testify about what I witnessed so that others could believe. My witness has served not as proof that compels belief. God always preserves human freedom to accept or reject his revelation, but as evidence that invites people to consider seriously the possibility that the Catholic faith's supernatural claims are actually, literally true. In 2023, I was invited to Rome to participate in a symposium on contemporary sanctity and digital evangelization, held in conjunction with the ongoing process toward Carlo's potential canonization. During this symposium, I had the profound privilege of meeting other individuals from around the world who had been touched by Carlo's intercession or who had their own extraordinary experiences related to him. One Australian man shared that his daughter had been healed of a supposedly incurable genetic disorder after his family had prayed a novena to Blessed Carlo. Medical records documented her condition and the inexplicable healing, and the case was being investigated as a potential miracle. But what moved me even more than the dramatic healing miracles were the countless testimonies of quiet spiritual transformations. Young people who had returned to confession after years away, families who had resumed attending Sunday Mass together, individuals who had found meaning and purpose through discovering Carlo's story and his message that ordinary people can become saints by putting God first in their everyday lives. These spiritual fruits of Carlo's intercession and example seemed to me even more significant than physical healings, because they represented souls being drawn closer to God, the ultimate purpose for which miracles exist. During my time in Rome for the symposium, I had the opportunity to visit the tomb where Carlo's body rests in Assisi, in the sanctuary of the Renunciation in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore. Standing before that simple tomb, seeing the steady stream of pilgrims, many of them teenagers and young adults, who came to pray and ask Carlo's intercession, I felt the weight of 19 years of carrying this testimony lift from my shoulders. I had fulfilled the mission Carlo had prophetically entrusted to me. I had witnessed, I had kept prudent silence, and I had spoken when the time was right. Now the testimony lived beyond me, taking on its own life in the hearts of all those who heard it and allowed it to deepen their faith. At Carlo's tomb, I prayed for perhaps an hour, expressing my gratitude for having known him, for having been chosen to witness the supernatural light, for having been given the courage to eventually speak publicly despite my fears and doubts. And as I prayed, I felt a familiar presence, not the dramatic supernatural phenomena of that October evening in 2006, but a gentle, warm sense of Carlo's spiritual nearness, as if he were standing beside me as an older brother or friend, grateful that I had carried out the mission he had foreseen and entrusted to me. Since publicly sharing my testimony, I have been asked countless times whether I have witnessed any other supernatural phenomena or whether the experience with Carlo was a singular event in my priestly life. I answer honestly that I have not witnessed anything comparable in dramatic intensity to the light from Carlo's body, but that having witnessed it once has made me more attentive to the subtle ways God manifests His presence constantly in the world around us. I see miracles now where before I might have seen only coincidence, in the timing of a phone call that arrives exactly when someone desperately needs to hear a friendly voice, in the chance encounter that leads to a life-changing conversation, in the small daily graces that God provides to those who ask for His help. My entire approach to priesthood has been recalibrated by the knowledge that the supernatural is not safely confined to Bible stories and medieval hagiography, but breaks through into our modern world when God chooses to reveal His glory. I celebrate Mass now with a constant awareness that something genuinely supernatural is occurring at the moment of consecration, that bread and wine are truly becoming the body and blood of Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit and the ministry of the priest. I counsel people in the confessional with renewed confidence in the real forgiveness of sins that occurs in this sacrament. I anoint the sick with heightened faith in the healing, physical or spiritual, that God can provide through this sacramental grace. In essence, witnessing the light from Carlo's body demolished any residual compartmentalization I had unconsciously maintained between my intellectual belief in Catholic teaching and my lived experience as a priest. They are no longer two separate realms, doctrine and practice, but a unified whole in which I know, not just believe, that the supernatural realities we profess are actual truth. For those watching this video who may be struggling with doubt about whether God is real, whether miracles happen, whether there is anything beyond the material world that science can measure and explain, I want to speak directly to you now. I am not a gullible person prone to religious delusion. I am an educated man with a graduate degree in theology and 34 years of pastoral experience. I approach extraordinary claims with healthy skepticism and careful discernment. But I am telling you, with absolute certainty grounded in what I saw with my own eyes and what was corroborated by other credible witnesses, that I witnessed supernatural light emanating from the body of Carlo Acutis that could not possibly be explained by any natural cause. This was not a trick of lighting or an optical illusion or an emotionally induced hallucination. It was objectively real, and it was a visible manifestation of the transforming presence of God within a human soul that had been so completely surrendered to divine grace that heaven's light shone through him even before death. If this could happen to a 15-year-old boy from Milan who loved computers and soccer and video games, it demonstrates that sanctity is not reserved for ancient ascetics or cloistered mystics, but is available to every person who chooses to put God first and to receive Christ in the Eucharist with authentic faith and love. Before I conclude this testimony, I want to extend a personal invitation to everyone watching. If this story has moved something in your heart, if you feel a stirring of curiosity or hunger for deeper faith, I encourage you to learn more about Blessed Carlo Acutis. Read about his life, study his example, pray for his intercession, and most importantly, take seriously his central message, that the Eucharist is our highway to heaven, that regular reception of Holy Communion can transform us into saints, and that ordinary young people in our modern world can achieve extraordinary holiness by living their daily lives with God at the center. Subscribe to this channel now if you haven't already, because there are more testimonies like mine that need to be shared, more witnesses to God's supernatural activity in our world who are finding the courage to speak after years of silence. And in the comments below, I want to hear from you. Has this testimony affected how you think about the Eucharist? Has it given you hope that the supernatural claims of Christianity might actually be true? Have you had your own experiences of divine intervention that you've been hesitant to share? Your story matters, and it might be exactly what another person needs to hear to take their own step toward faith. Finally, I want to leave you with Carlo's own words that have guided my life since his death. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. Whatever highway you're currently traveling in your spiritual journey, whatever distance you feel from God or the Church, know that the highway is always open, always available, always ready to bring you home to the Father who loves you more than you can imagine. Carlo found that highway and traveled it faithfully for 15 years. I witnessed the supernatural light that confirmed where that highway had brought him. Now I'm inviting you to find that same highway and begin your own journey toward the light that awaits all who seek God with sincere hearts. May Blessed Carlo Acutis intercede for all of us, and may the light I witnessed emanating from his body be a sign of hope that guides us toward our own encounters with the living God who still works miracles in our skeptical, secular age. Thank you for listening to this testimony that I carried in silence for 19 years. May it bear fruit in your heart and draw you closer to the source of all light, truth, and love. Amen.